Okay, thank you, Haro. And well, let me first of all start then with giving a compliment to Esra and Dominic. I thought it was a very fine report. I really enjoyed reading it, not only because it provides such an adequate summary of all the underlying information for which many of us probably have no time to go to the primary literature in the first place, so it is a time-saving activity, at least in a world that is sometimes time-constrained. But I thought it was also nice because they emphasized this idea of what they call a socio-technical phenomenon. For my background, I am a biologist working in soils, and I may have a certain natural tendency to immediately translate comments on SRI into praise or criticism of certain soil biological mechanisms, and I will definitely say a few things about it in the end of my comments. But it made clear, the report, that there is much more to it and that the social and institutional dimension needs as much emphasis as well. At the same time, when I read the report, I did realize that the SRI debate is not as unique as it may have seemed. Like SRI is not as unique as Dominic said as well. If you see some of the terms of the debate, it smells pretty much like some of the earlier debates that have been around the way in which agriculture should innovate or should increase productivity. And the SRI debate is just confronted with the same fundamental question whether agricultural task in a world of growing populations and an increasing risk of food scarcity, whether agriculture should spend its resources in improving what's called the yield ceiling, so the maximum productivity, or whether they should spend time in narrowing the actual yield gap, the difference between what you could do under certain conditions and what farmers actually achieve. And certainly part of the comments on the debate suggest that that issue has been far from resolved. But it explains at least that when SRI proponents claimed that SRI not only makes the yield gap smaller, but actually has done something about the yield ceiling as well, that some conventional biologists and molecular biologists have exploded, that at least they thought that was their domain rather than that of some of the other people. And so it suggests it's a debate that has been played in more instances, and the final conclusion by Dominic, where he introduced the Grand Revolution, also suggests that there are some similarities. And I will come back to that in a second. That controversy, of course, relates to a much more fundamental controversy, which I would call the question, what are legitimate forms of research? The way in which science, with its often reductionist practices, with factorial experiments where we single out individual factors, is an effective way of demonstrating the superiority of that system, or whether different kinds of experiments with all the treatments combined are useful. And Dominic and Esra both mentioned it a couple of times. One of the famous words in the SRI community is synergy, or what the Lolanier called hysteresis. And well, I would not have cared if the authors of this report would have been more critical. I would rather have the feeling that the use of the word synergy is hindering progress in the SRI debate. And I would be very happy if we would stop using that word unless we have an operational definition of it that could help us. So I wouldn't have minded the footnote that the word may be ripe for the dustbin of history. But at least that issue of what are legitimate forms of research also then enters the debate about the credibility of what people have been proposing and the extent to which it is an alternative to agriculture or whether it builds upon. And certainly if you seek credibility for your activities within the scientific community, it's all too common to emphasize the continuity between all the practices and what SRI is doing, and I think for good reasons. But you can imagine that people who feel threatened by that community immediately emphasize the way in which it departs from and is not as legitimate as other forms of doing science. That about the science part. The other thing that I liked is the general idea in the social sciences about agriculture as performance, or the emphasis on skills. And I think many of the adoption studies suggest that it is skill related. And of course, if you look at the adopters, then you have a good idea how a technology can help people developing skill. I saw a somewhat smaller note in the report where they left open the possibility that with increasing skills there may be an increase in labor demand that may be filled by people that are less skilled, have less time for their own field operations. And so one major question that I did not see on that list, but would I think would be relevant, is whether changed labor relations because of the demand for more and sometimes more skilled, but sometimes also more unskilled labor, would increase inequalities in the villages where SRI is ongoing. And I think that could be a major question. One other thing that I would have loved to see a bit more extended in their report is the historical context, how de Lanier came to his ideas. When I was in Paris a few years ago, I bought the book. I started reading it, but I realized my French was not as good as I had naively assumed it to be, so I went till about page 25 and kept it aside for a moment. I would have the time. But what I did realize was that Lanier was also much more critical about traditional practices in Madagascar. And so when Dominique just raised the question about alternatives to green revolution that go back to earlier practices, as far as I have read the Lanier, I think he was extremely critical of the practices that the Malgasian farmers applied. And so he definitely did not see this as the basis for innovation. So he was much more critical. And I think the way in which his farming systems analysis raises some of those questions may be very important for the SRI community to take up. One thing that de Lanier mentioned, and for which I did not see any picture today, is that de Lanier wondered why in Madagascar he saw more cattle, more zebus, than he saw humans. And he said, well, there are so many cattle and so few of them are working. And so apparently he had a strong feeling that some forms of agriculture that were practiced there were really backwards and were blocking the agricultural productivity. Well, that raised for him the question whether you should use more draft animals for traction for soil tillage. And that then, for me as a soil scientist, raises the question whether there is some link between the emphasis on working the soil, aerating the soil, disturbing the soil, now with mechanical weeders, had something to do with the underlying idea that there was too much idle labor force in the form of animals around. Certainly, as a purely scientific challenge, the claims that SRI makes on how soil disturbance increases aeration, but at the same time increases soil biological activity, whereas a major undercurrent now is just to promote conservation agriculture with less soil disturbance as being beneficial for soil life, is a debate that has not been solved. It looks like SRI is more effective on the more fertile soils. That has been mentioned by Ezra and Dominic. You could well imagine that on the richer soils, especially if you also continue disturbing the soil, you release more nutrients and so create a positive feedback between intrinsically better conditions and a further nutrient enrichment with claims to superiority. But when it claims the superiority, at the same time it raises a fundamental question about the sustainability of that system. And much more long-term data are needed to really claim that it is as sustainable and that it's not being parasitic on excess of nutrients that have been applied before. And that is one question, if this is going to be on a larger scale, whether the practices are sustainable in that long term. So I think, to summarize, there are lots of nice things in the report, but it suggests that we may have a better perspective of some of the questions we have to address. And happily enough, and that's what the report also makes clear, many of those questions are liable to testing. And so the challenge is not to continue to debate, but to go out in the field with the farmers and to really study and test some of those practices and their mechanisms. Thank you.